If you are reading this, then I'm dead, and you are standing aboard the desolate Cyclone-class patrol ship, the USS Mistral, with her engines dead and her electrical system non-functional. I am, or was the XO of this vessel, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Simmons. Please read this carefully. If you're an officer or enlisted band of the United States Navy, this is an order. Scuttle this vessel immediately. Do not finish this letter. Get off the Minstrel at once and send her down. Consider this a quarantine scenario. All hands are likely dead. God help you if they're not. We are 8 days out of Kirkwall, tracking an interdimensional and scrambled distress call from what appears to be an Iceland fishing vessel, the Magnus Dotteri, deep in the non-fishing zone of the North Sea. We found the vessel, or rather we found a mile-wide streak of oil and fragments, the largest of them still burning. The night before, the enlisted men of watch had reported seeing a flash of light on the horizon. The Minestrel's crew were nowhere to be found, except for one lone fisherman, unburned and floating in the far end of the debris field. He had been shot in the forehead with a small caliber revolver. When we fished his pale blue corpse from the frigid water, he was still clutching a fishing knife in one clamped hand. What we're able to piece together from the fragment and confined evidence was that for reasons unknown, the crew had been in conflict, resulting in the murder of at least one sailor and the eventual sabotage and destruction of the ship. Visibility was only a few hundred feet away as we spent the next day drifting silently along the debris in hopes of finding a survivor. The crew was already visibly shaking by the discovery. The grim dread of the fog and the lone smoldering pieces of the Magnetoreus that collided with our hull unsettled even the most seasoned of us. We had expected an easy cruise and the simple retrieval of a dozen thankful Iceland fishermen. What we got at first was a silent and oil-slick coast sea, a single corpse, and more than a few nagging questions. The Mistral had just been surfaced after an extended tour of the Atlantic fleet of Baron before her transfer to the North Sea. She was in good running order, so I can only assume that the initial mechanical failure was the act of sabotage or some external force. It happened at the first night when our final sweep had been completed and we returned to the site of the Minstrel's first transmission. There was nothing initially remarkable about the spot, a cold and lonely set of coordination and little less. I was in my cabin, just settling down with a call surrounded by the captain, offering little information, just a stern order to meet him on deck. Dressing quickly, I emerged from the cabin into the cloud of pebble unease and fear. The enlisted men and the junior officers were coursing through the ship towards the deck like panicking rats. No one made eye contact or spoke. There was none of the usual gallows of humor or camaraderie that bubbled up of a situation of limited information, just a grim interior that pulls us out in the Arctic night. On deck, the night was unnaturally clear and cold, and the bright of the stars burned in the frosty air. Around us in every direction, just a few hundred yards away, the fog and clouds whirled, and if held at bay by our presence. The captain was at the railing, leaning over along with the men on watch. I approached him, suddenly desperate and panicked to know what was happening. When I saw it, the light flooded up from beneath us. The sea was flat, like a surface on a mirror. The water was black, reflecting a pale pinpricks of the stars. But beneath the surface, something glowed with the cold light. Pulsating shapes of violet green and deep cobalt blue shore from beneath. They flowed and merged and shimmered silently down below the glassy sea. We stared, 24 men and women stuck dumb and horrified by the sight. There was a sense of scale of emerge from the fluid among the other lights. They seemed to be many further beneath us, which would make them terribly large and impossibly fast. There was no solid shapes, and no disturbance of the water, just a deep field of liquid flowing light. We watched for what seemed like hours, entranced by the mesmerizing ballet of cold light and mirror reflection of the northern lights. When it ended abruptly, there was 3 almost simultaneous events. First, the light seemed to contract, each mote freezing in place and then collapsing like an iris of the eyes in bright sunlight. Secondly, there was a tremor in the air that first raised the hair on the back of my neck. As the ghostly lights winked out of existence, it rose in an instantly, until I thought my eyeballs might shake their way out of my head. Through the fog of sudden pain, I heard a noise raising above the Arctic wind, a humming vibration from the minstrel herself that matched the electric shudder in my skull. It was as if a light bulb aboard the minstrel was suddenly flushed with power, flaring bright and buzzing noisily in the housings. And when the wine had reached the fever pitch, they began to pop and shatter among the shatter of sparks. From start to finish, it lasted less than 2 seconds, and we were left floating silently in the dark waters, beneath the starry sky, on a dead and crippled boat. The damage was invisible, without any obvious cause in total. Nothing aboard the minstrel worked. Each carefully crafted system of manipulated resonance had been crumbled. Every light was shattered, and even the replacement bulbs and the small flashlights that all of us carried held fused and useless filaments. Satellite phones, shortwave radios, all means of communication were useless bricks of plastic and wire. Every battery was dead, every stereo system was silent. We were adrifted, without sail or engine, isolated from the world by 100 miles of black and silent sea. The crew moved through the ship that first night like moles, fumbling through the dark corridors with only a few pale green chemical lights to check each system. They relayed each disheartening message like a fire brigade through the darkness, to where the captain and I stood on the deck, trying to make sense of this senseless. At last, when nothing else could be done, I fumbled my way back to my cabin and tried to sleep. The darkness feels like an oppressive many-fingered hands slowly gripping my chest. The next morning, I again took the stock on our situation, hoping for some fragments of hope we had passing through the night. The damage was total. We would have to find a way to send distress calls and hope that we had not drifted too far away from our last known coordinations. The men may not have known the full details, but it was clear from their haunted visage that they knew how dire the situation was. The first death was that afternoon. The sound of screaming brought me above deck and into the thick, heavy fog. High in the gloom, I could see bright burning specks of light descending slowly. My stomach turned. It was 2 signal flares drifting uselessly through the haze. Some damn fool had fired the signal flares. I burned with the unfamiliar and foreign rage and rushed through the fog of the foredeck that with hatred in my blood and my fist clamped tight. The scene then emerged from the fog, broke me from my stupor. The enlisted man, a flare gun still in his hand, lay broken in a pool of blood. The captain stood over him, clutching the rails, driving a heel in his boot repeatedly into the broken mess of the boy's skull. I realized then that the screaming I heard, the high keeling wail, was coming from the captain, his face in the ritual of animal rage. Around them was a small crowd standing motionless and silent, watching like sentinels. The captain turned to see me and dropped into a crouch. His fingers wrapped around the flare gun and he raised his level with my eyes. We stared for a long moment at each other, our eyes locked as he panted heavily, his face slightly splattered with blood. The only sound was the wet, gargling exhale from the enlisted man's death rattle, a bubble of blood forming on his ruined face. I've served with this man for nearly a decade. This was not the man I knew. This was a hollow version filled with violence and terror. I spoke to him then. In a soothed voice, I asked him to hand me the flare gun. He said nothing at first, and then spoke, his voice a tiny trembling sound that was swallowed up by the thick gloom around us. He murdered us, Ryan. The fog. The flares will never... He shook his head and clenched his eyes tight, as if he were trying to shake himself from a dream. Then he shuddered once, violently, his back arching like a seizure. "This little fuck has killed us," he choked out, the flare gun waving in the air, and I took a step closer, reaching out for him. He opened his eyes and I froze again as we stared silently at one another. "You're going to die here," he giggled quietly. "I always wanted to watch you die, you fucking coward." He tilted his head back and laughed, one hyena-like bark of the gray sky, and then put the flare gun in his mouth and fired. The last flare igniting and temporarily bathing his head in a hollow of magnesium orange and smoke. He trembled back over the railing. If there was a splash when he hit the water, it was swallowed by the fog. I stood for what seemed like a very long time. It slowly dawned on me that I was alone. The silent audience had melted away below decks, no doubt taking the grim tale with them. I feared for moral and absurd concerns, I realized now, but could not move from the spot. As if sheer force of will would cause the sea to regurgitate this man, my friend. The first gunshot broke me from my reverie. In the emergency locker room, I found that the handful of flare guns remained, and I stuffed one into each pocket and entered the dim passageway to below deck. Over the hollow retort of gunshots, other muffled sound began to emerge. The choking sobs, the screams of pain and anger, all bringing the faint impression of the copper smell of blood. The dark was oppressive and thick as my heart rose to my chest. The pale, fading light of the chemical glow stick that hung at regular intervals illuminated the bare corridor, and I moved slowly towards my cabin. It had been sacked and my service pistol was missing. The next two cabins headed to the corpses of the junior officers, their broken forms still in their bunkers, skull open like a blossom flowers under the point-blank shots. I felt the distinct and irrational desire to run on deck and leap overboard, to swim away from the boat unto the unknown sea. I gripped the flare gun and held it out ahead of me, less like a weapon and more like a talisman, and began to pace slowly down the corridor to the enlisted bunks. The door was wide open, and the smell of blood and fear and shit was nauseating. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, I saw a field of bodies, torn, shredded, and shattered by bullets and makeshift clubs. A few of the men still moved, twitching slightly. I watched in frozen terror as one man, his face a mask of blood and rage, turned up his head to regard me, and with a weak cry of rage, began to drag himself with his arms, trailing a broken and shattered leg towards me. From the shadows, another form pounced on him, a booted digging into the wanderer's man's back with a wet cracking sound. I recognized the attacker's face in the green chemical dim, a quiet and bookish young man. Like the captain, this was not the man I knew. This was a beast in his flesh. He reached down and grabbed the wounded man's jaw, thumb slipped into his mouth. The wounded man growled and ferrled mindlessly sound and tried to bite down, but his attacker gripped tight and pulled. The jaw came off with the sound of tearing tendons and Udlin's shrieks that vanished into the air. I was no longer breathing, holding silently at the entrance, but the attacker snapped his head up to see me, nostrils flaring. The jawbone hit the floor with a meaty sound as he lunged towards me with a silent animal grace. I fired the flare gun, and it hit him square in the chest. His shirt caught fire and all air escaped his lungs with a sudden forceful exhale, but impossibly he continued on towards me. As I passed through the portal and slammed the door, the fire had climbed up to his hair and he was squealing now. He clawed hands still outreached towards me. I felt him impacting against the door and saw the nightmare visage weathered in fire through the small porthole. Lips already burnt away to reveal 2 rows of perfect teeth. He wailed and began to smash his burning form against the door. Once, twice, 3 times, then silence. I raised my eyes in the porthole and saw only a faint image of the burning shape as it disappeared into darkness. All consciousness thought evaporated and I fled from the Cardinal house. I have barricaded all entrance to below deck now, and have doomed myself to slow death at the hands of the enveloping cold. I still hear the living ones down there, screaming and banging at the door. They are not the men I knew. I console myself with that thought, as if leaving them in the dark to starve or murder each other. If you have read this far and have not fled these waters, or God forbid are still aboard on the Minstrel, then I beg you again, leave now while you can. Do not look below deck. There are none of us left to save, and certainly none worth saving. It's cold now, and the fading days surrounding a worn gray light in the dark. There are no stars this night, nothing but a heavy blanket of night. If I could get below, I would find some way of destroying the Minstrel, like the brave men of the Minsterdom. But it's too late. The most I can make of this last moments, as all my feelings start to flee from me, and writing becomes impossible, is a warning. Please, send us into the deep. Tell no one you found us, and never return. There are things and primal desires older than man, and force beyond the grasp of our simple minds. And they dwell here, beneath the frozen sea.